Just a minute, we are just recording this session. Yeah. Uh, Before I ask Pranav to formally introduce the speaker, just want to state one thing that though our today's speaker is a well-renowned and an acclaimed professor of tax, though he claims himself to be a keen learner and a keen student of tax, I must just remind that these are very modest word of a humble person. With this, may I request Pranav to formally introduce the speaker for everyone's benefit?
Yes. Thank you, Anuj. A very good evening to all the members of the study circle, and thank you so much to Advocate Devendra Jain for gracing us with your presence. I'm pretty sure everyone already knows about his accolades, but I would still like it will humble me to introduce him. So, starting from all the way from his academics, he is a chartered accountant. He's been a rank holder at the CA Foundation Intermediate as well as final level, and he's also graduated LLB and completed his general management program from IIM Calcutta. As far as his professional career is concerned, presently he's practicing as an advocate in the field of direct tax, indirect tax, and corporate and allied laws as a proprietor of DHJ Legal, and appears in the Supreme Court, High Court, and tribunals. Previously, he was practicing. He was a practicing chartered accountant for 19 years in the field of direct taxes, litigation, consultancy, and transfer pricing, and he was also a partner in CVK and Associates, which was a CA firm. He has co-authored several books, like a book on ICDS, a practical guide, which is published by BCAS, a book on recovery of taxes, which was published by CTC, a co-author of budget publication by the BCAS, and co-author of a book on Section 56.210, a treatise, which was published by Taxman. He has also received several accolades, one of them being the Best Lecture Award from Sales Tax Practitioner Association for delivering lecture on impact of Hawala purchases and income tax assessment in the year 2014. He's been the past chairman of Direct Tax Committee and member of Managing Council and Law and Representation Committee of the CTC. He regularly contributes articles in professional magazines like the BCA Journal, Income Tax Review, CCS Direct Tax Online, etc., and regularly delivers lectures to us troglodytes. Thank you so much, Devendra sir, for gracing us with your presence and sharing this amazing topic, like giving us a lecture on this amazing topic. And without any further ado, I will hand over the floor to you.
Thank you, Pranabhai, for the for the nice introduction. Respected conveners of Moon Study Circle.
Sorry to interrupt you, sir, but your video is off. So
yeah, it's fine now.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Preeti Madam, seniors in profession, conveners of Matunga Study Circle, other professional colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, very good evening to you all. At the outset, let me thank the Matunga Study Circle for giving me the opportunity to speak on this very important topic of recent pronouncement in income tax. I've tried to select decisions which are more of practical significance in our day-to-day practice. And before we start discussing the judgment, which in fact I have tried to classify between different topics, but I want to clarify one thing about decisions. That these are the decisions which are delivered by either Supreme Court, High Court, or the various tribunals. That is the judiciary in short. In our democratic setup, where we have a 3 tiers of democracy, legislature makes the law, it is the executive who implements the law. And when there is a clash between the executive and the subject, that is the assessees. It is a judiciary which intervenes and tries to uphold the law. But judiciary never creates the law. Creating law is the prerogative of legislature. And once the law is created by the legislature, it is open to debate, it is open to different interpretations by anybody who is a reader of the subject. Be it an advocate, be it a chartered accountant, be a departmental officer, be a tribunal member, or be it a high court judge. So everybody tries to read the law, tries to read the context of the law, tries to read the objective of the legislature in enacting that particular law. And then he delivers the judgment, which is always delivered in a peculiar circumstances, that is the facts of that particular case. And in real life scenario, the facts of two particular cases are never 100% identical. There could be similarity, but they cannot be 100% identical always. And therefore, before coming to any conclusion, it is very important that we see the context, the factual background in which a particular decision has been delivered. As told in the beginning in my introduction that I have been an academician, I have been a teacher for so many years. What I've observed in the young professionals and students is their love for judgments. The moment a particular judgment comes, the young generation especially is either very happy if the judgment is favorable or becomes very sad if the judgment is against them, as if it is the end of the world. So before we begin with analyzing or reading different judgments, my humble request is that don't be very excited when you see a favorable judgment. Don't be very sad when you see any unfavorable judgments. Everyday judgments keep on coming and going. What is the judgment today? You never know. Monday morning, what I discussed today might be overruled by High Court or Supreme Court and a new law will be developed. What is delivered by Supreme Court today, you never know. In the next Finance Act, there is an amendment, sometimes even with retrospective effect, to overrule or nullify the effect of the judgment. And to give an illustration, I've tried to take one very first decision, which though does not pertain to the subject allotted to me, and that is the recent pronouncements in income tax. But the very first judgment which I've taken relates to GST. Because in last 1.5 months, there is one particular judgment which has been circulating so much on social media that for the input credit under section 16 of the GST Act, there is a condition that unless and until the tax is paid by the seller in the government kitty, the buyer will not get the input credit. That of course has been challenged. The constitutional virus of the particular section has been challenged in so many high courts. But a judgment has been spreading in social media that no GST can be demanded from the buyer if there is a default on the part of the seller. Now, the point which I want to convey is what is being circulated in the WhatsApp and what is in reality the effect of that judgment is, in my view, totally different. What is being circulated in the social media is that once you have paid the tax and you have a valid tax invoice issued by a supplier, even if he defaults, that cannot be recovered from the buyer. That is the message which is spreading in the social media. There is a particular judgment. In reality, if we see the facts of the judgment and what the High Court has analyzed, that in this case, on the seller's default, input tax credit was being denied to the buyer. The buyer made the plea that I have paid the amount along with the tax to the seller. Therefore, tax should be recovered from the seller. The officer did not pursue any remedy against the seller and passed an order against the buyer. The buyer filed a writ petition before the High Court, and High Court observed that as per section 16, if the seller defaults, then buyer is denied the credit. However, High Court read it like this, that at least some steps should be taken by the sales tax officer against the seller without examining the seller, just because the seller has given the statement that there was no actual movement of goods. In that scenario, High Court observed that in fact it was more important to have the examination of the seller and give a cross-examination opportunity to the buyer. If that has not been done, it's a gross violation of principles of natural justice. So what High Court has ultimately done is, High Court has set aside the order and restored the matter back to the sales tax officer with a direction that an opportunity should be given to the buyer to cross-examine the seller, and steps should be taken by the department firstly to recover tax from the seller, and if they fail to do so, then only tax should be recovered from the buyer. So in reality, what is the ultimate ratio of the judgment is totally different from what is being spread in the social media. So just be very careful that whenever any social media, WhatsApp or LinkedIn or some forward is circulating, try to read the full judgment and not just the head note or a particular analysis given by somebody in the social media of that judgment. Read the full facts of the case, the context in which it is delivered, then examine your facts and then take a call whether that will fit in your particular scenario. Coming back to our topic, judgments in income tax. The first set of faceless assessments have just concluded a couple of months back. So certain decisions dealing with the tragedies of the faceless assessment and their remedies. Now in normal scenario, once an assessment order is passed, howsoever bad it is, the remedy is to first file an appeal before the commissioner appeal. But the biggest problem of filing an appeal before the commissioner appeal is that the department will pursue the recovery. For granting a stay, you need to make a 20% deposit. The problem arises when there is a high-pitched assessment. The assessed income is so many times of the returned income, then making deposit even of the 20% tax payment is a very difficult task. And when there is a gross violation of the principles of natural justice, then that particular assessment can be directly challenged before the High Court under Article 226 of the Constitution. In the first series of judgment, I have included certain judgments passed by our jurisdictional High Court as well as Delhi High Court and several other High Courts as to how High Court is directly interfered with the assessment order passed in faceless scenario. The very first judgment of Bombay High Court, it's an interim order. In the facts of the case, a show cause notice and draft assessment order was issued to the assessee. Assessee filed a reply for it and sought personal hearing. That opportunity of personal hearing was not given and a final order was passed, making huge addition to the income. So assessee filed a writ petition against that order and also challenged the constitutional validity of section 144B7, which provides for personal hearing in faceless only if certain parameters are met. High Court has issued notice and stayed the operation of the order and the consequential recovery and penalty proceeding. In another decision of Bhavin Mukund Mehta, here also the personal hearing was not granted. High Court held that if personal hearing had been granted, petitioner would have been in a better position to explain his submission. And since it was not granted, the order was set aside and the assessing officer was directed to give personal hearing and then only pass an appropriate order of assessment. In another judgment of Bombay High Court in Dennis James Fernandez, in this case, assessee was given only 4 days time, which in fact practically we have seen in most of the cases that only 3 days or 4 days time is given to file reply. Here High Court has taken serious cognizance of the fact that such a short time should not be granted. In the facts of this case, before the passing of the order, assessee had filed the reply, but that was after the allotted time. The time allotted was 4 days. Assessee filed the replies within 6 days. Unfortunately, the order was passed after the assessee submission, but just because it was not submitted within the allotted time of 4 days, assessing officer did not take cognizance of that. So even that order was set aside by the High Court by exercising its extraordinary jurisdiction under Article 226. Similar orders were passed by Delhi High Court, where they held that Section 144(b)(7) gives a statutory right to the assessee to seek personal hearing. High Court has also observed that the use of the word may cannot absolve the revenue from the obligation to provide personal hearing to the assessee, and therefore an order passed without giving opportunity of personal hearing to the assessee was set aside even by the Delhi High Court. These are few judgments dealing with faceless assessment. If anybody wants to ask any questions about that, you can take the question in between and make the session a little bit interactive.
Yes, sir. As of now, nobody has posted queries in the chat box or raise their hand. We can go ahead. Members, just a small request, as sir has stated, that you can raise the queries on a real-time basis as and when the topic is discussed, so that we have it as more of an interactive session than as a monologue.
Thank you. Moving forward, certain decisions relating to various assessment procedure. The very burning issue of notices issued under Section 148 after 1st of April 2021. Now, in normal scenario, the procedure to challenge a reopening has been explained by the Honorable Supreme Court in the case of GK and Driveshaft, that once a reassessment notice has been issued, the first step for the assessee is to file a return in response to that notice. Thereafter, assessee may ask for the reasons for reopening, and he may file his objections to the assessing officer. Once he files those objections, the assessing officer should dispose of that objection by speaking order. And if the assessee is not satisfied with that, he may move the jurisdictional high court in a writ jurisdiction challenging the reopening of assessment. Now, recently what has happened is in the last year, when we were facing this countrywide lockdown, the first lockdown announced in the month of March 2020. At that time, assessment year 13-14 reopening notices were getting time barred on 31st of March 2020. The government came out with an ordinance which was later replaced by an act known as Taxation Laws Relaxation of Certain Provisions Act 2020. that is TLA 2020. Under section 3 of TLA 2020, central government was empowered to issue notification extending the compliance date by SSE as well as the time limit for completion of any action by the department. By exercising that power given by section 3, various notifications were issued from time to time, extending the due date till 31st of March 2020, thereafter to 30th of April and finally to 30th of June 2020. However, in between, when this Finance Bill 2021 became a Finance Act 2021, under this Finance Act, the entire scheme of reopening was substituted by a new section 147, 148, 149 and 151. And along with that, a new section 148A was inserted that prior to issue of notice under section 148, an opportunity should be given to the assessee under section 148A. Now, when these notifications were issued extending the due date for issuing notices under section 148, in the last two notifications, that is notification number 20 and notification number 38, government introduced one explanation in the notification that the notices which will be issued under this extended notification will be governed by the old law. And that has precisely been challenged in so many decisions, in so many cases before the High Court. That particular explanation inserted in the notification is ultra vires section 3 of the TLA, because section 3 of the TLA had only given power to the central government to notify the extended dates. There was no power, and in fact, in law, there could be no such power delegating central government to issue notification to decide which law will be applicable. And in fact, after 1st of April, when these sections are substituted, the old section no longer are in existence. Therefore, to the extent that the notification says that notices issued for the earlier periods will be governed by the old law, that is wholly unconstitutional. There is a plea raised before the Honorable Bombay High Court. And in a series of decisions like this, Sahil International, Mahindra and Mahindra, Tata Communications, and a lot of decisions, in fact, more than 100 writ petitions have been filed in Bombay itself. And Bombay High Court has stayed those reassessment notices and issued notices to the Attorney General of India as constitutional validity of the notification, as well as the TLA 2020 has been challenged. That was followed by Delhi High Court and Calcutta High Court, Madhya Pradesh High Court and Gujarat High Court. So in several states, such reassessment notices have been stayed by the High Courts. As far as Bombay is concerned, all these matters are clubbed together and now posted for further hearing on 13th of September. The department has to file reply to these writ petitions. Another decision of Madras High Court in B. Kubendran's case, it deals with the scenario whether notice under section 143(2) is mandatorily required to be issued in case of an assessment to be done under section 153(c). Now, earlier in the context of old block assessment scheme under section 158 BD, Supreme Court in Hotel Blue Moon reported in 321 ITR 362 has held that even in block assessment case, it is mandatory for the assessing officer to serve a notice under section 143(2). The decision of Hotel Blue Moon is consistently followed by various High Court and tribunal, even in the context of assessment under Section 153 or 153C, or for that matter, Section 148. However, in this judgment, Madras High Court has given a judgment against the assessee and said that the language of Section 153A is different from the language of Section 158BC. Supreme Court decision in Hotel Blue Moon was in the context of Section 158BC, where there was a specific mention about Section 143(2). However, if we read current Section 153A, there is no specific mention of Section 143(2), but it only says that return filed in response to notice under Section 153A will be regarded as a return under Section 139, and all the provisions of the Act, so far as may be, shall apply. So Madras High Court has said that because in Blue Moon Hotel's case, there was a specific mention of Section 143(2) in Section 158BC, whereas in 153A, there is no specific mention, and therefore, Madras High Court has distinguished the judgment of Supreme Court and held that 143(2) notice is not required to be issued in 153A or 153C cases. With due respect to Madras High Court, in my humble understanding, even though the wordings of Section 153A are general in nature, but when it says specifically that the return filed in response to 153A or 153C notice will be considered as a return required to be filed under Section 139, and the further condition that all other provisions of the Act, so far as may be, shall apply accordingly. So in my humble view, even though the mention is general that all other provisions of the Act shall apply, but because the return is equated to a return under Section 139, before completing the assessment, it is must for an assessing officer to issue notice under Section 143(2). That is my personal interpretation. Moving forward, Karnataka High Court, a very good judgment in the context of reopening. Here what had happened was, in 1976, in one of the decisions of Kalyanji Mauji and Company, Supreme Court had held that if the assessing officer commits any mistake at the time of original assessment, then he has the power to reopen that assessment to correct his own inadvertence or mistake. However, later on, in another judgment of Indian and Eastern Newspaper Society, a three-bench decision of Supreme Court held that the earlier decision in Kalyanji Mauji and Company was not correct. So recently, Karnataka High Court has reiterated that if an original assessment is already completed by the assessing officer, but due to inadvertence or mistake, some income remains to be assessed, merely to rectify his own mistake, he cannot carry on a 147 reopening, because that will amount to a case of change of opinion, which is not permissible in view of the Supreme Court judgment in case of Calvinator of India. And therefore, High Court finally held that discovery of oversight, inadvertence or mistake of assessing officer or error on consideration of same material is not permissible under Section 147. In the decision of Savita Kapila, Delhi High Court dealt with a situation where a reopening notice is issued in the name of a dead person. Delhi High Court held that once the assessee is no longer in existence, notice cannot be issued in the name of a non-existing person. One of the plea raised by department in this case was that the legal representative had not informed the fact of death to the assessee. This proposition was also dealt by Delhi High Court, saying that there is no statutory provision casting a duty on the legal representative to inform the fact of death, and therefore no fault can be found in the legal representative, even if he has not informed the fact of death. The moment an assessee has that the proper course of action for the assessing officer to issue notice in the name of legal representative if notice is issued directly in the name of dead person, such a notice as well as the consequential assessment order is bad in law. Next decision of Supreme Court in case of Kunal structure, it deals with a situation as to time limit for issue of notice under section 143(2) should be considered from the time of filing the return of income or from the time the defect in that return are rectified. Associate filed return under section 139(1) in the month of September 2016. This return was considered to be defective under section 139(9). Assessee was called upon to remove the defect, which it did in the month of July 2017. Now, under 143(2), the time limit to issue notice is 6 months from the end of the year in which the return is furnished. Assessee's plea was that the return was furnished in the financial year 16-17, and therefore 143(2) notice should be served by 30th of September 2017. Department's plea was that though it was furnished in the year 16-17, defects were removed in the year financial year 17-18, and therefore notice could be issued till September 2018. This was not accepted by the High Court as well as the Supreme Court. Supreme Court held that limitation under section 143(2) is to be calculated from the date of filing of the original return and not from the date on which the defects in those returns are removed. The next topic dealing with penalty, I think there are one or two questions. I'll just read in the chat box. With respect to request for personal hearing under section 144(b), if, say, example, the case has been reopened under section 147 just on the basis of a report of investigation name, and the assessee has large number of documents to prove the genuineness, and it is almost impossible to scan the documents, which runs in hundreds of pages, can the NESE or jurisdictional AO is under its right to reject the grant for personal hearing? See, this practical problem of a voluminous document difficult to scan, I understand this is a practical problem, but when it comes to the legal proposition, that obviously cannot be the ground to reject the personal hearing. However, in such a scenario, even if a personal hearing is granted, that cannot be substituted for making the written submission. And therefore, even if your submissions are voluminous and howsoever cumbersome it is, I believe you will have to find out some way to upload those documents. And probably, I believe in the old portal, there was a restriction that in one go you could attach maximum 10 attachment, and there was some MB restriction also. And therefore, they have spent more than, I think, 4,200 or 4,300 crores to make a state-of-art new income tax portal, where probably these problems will be solved. With that objective, they have launched the new portal. It is unfortunate that even if nearly 2 months after the enactment of introduction of the new portal, the portal is still not functioning properly. So let us wait for 2 or 3 more months. Let the portal be fully functional. And probably we may have answer to your problem of how to furnish that voluminous data. Moving forward to the next topic of penalty. Section 271(1)(c), which has now been replaced with a new section, section 270(a). But in the context of the old section 271(1)(c), which deals with either penalty for concealment of particulars of income or penalty for furnishing of inaccurate particulars of income. So many high courts and tribunals were dealing with this particular proposition as to what happens that if in the statutory notice issued under section 274, the particular limb has not been scored out and both of the limbs are mentioned, that is, it is for furnishing inaccurate particulars or it is for concealment of particulars of income. In various cases, penalty orders based on such notices have been struck down by high courts, have been declared to be a nullity by various tribunals. In some of the cases, a plea was raised that even though the statutory notice is in a standard format, but if in the assessment order the charge is properly mentioned, it is either for concealment or it is for furnishing inaccurate particulars of income, then a mere defect in the standard notice issued should not vitiate the entire proceeding and the entire imposition of penalty. This particular controversy, in fact, Bombay High Court, in two of the decisions, had given contradictory view on this particular aspect, that where the notices are issued in the standard format, where the assessment order is properly worded, whether it will cure the defect in the notice. And therefore, a reference was made to the full bench of Bombay High Court, in this particular case, of Mohammad Farhan A. Sheikh. In a very beautiful judgment authored by Honorable Justice Damas Seshadri Naidu, who has analyzed almost all the decisions of all the high courts on this particular subject matter of 271(1)(c. They also deal with the plea of prejudice to be caused to the assessee by striking or non-striking of the irrelevant portion in the notice. And finally, High Court held that in the assessment proceeding, the assessing officer only gives a prima facie view as to the launch of the penalty proceeding against the assessee. But the penalty proceeding do not begin with the assessment proceeding. They begin only with the issue of statutory notice under section 274. And therefore, a proper phraseology in the assessment order is not a substitute for a proper charge being worded out in the penalty notice itself. The assessment proceeding and penalty proceeding are different proceeding, and a defect in one cannot be cured by a specific wording in the other. So finally, High Court held that even though the assessment order is very specifically worded, however, penalty proceeding begin only with the statutory notice, and therefore, if the irrelevant portion in the notice is not struck down, it means the charge against the assessee is not very specifically borne out. Therefore, the entire proceeding is vitiated, and this simple defect in the notice of non-striking of irrelevant matter would vitiate the entire penalty proceeding. The next topic about appeal, revision and stay applications. As far as stay of demand is concerned, once an assessment order is passed, the first step for the assessee will be normally to file an appeal before the commissioner appeal. However, the power of stay still rests with the assessing officer, and filing of an appeal does not give any automatic stay to the assessee against the demand. He has to make a stay application before the assessing officer. In 2016, an office memorandum was issued by CBDT, which says that on 15% demand being paid, stay would normally be granted for the whole demand till the disposal of the first appeal. Later on, this percentage of 15 was increased to 20% by another office memorandum. However, in facts of certain cases, even this 20% payment becomes very difficult for an assessee, more so when the assessment is a very high-pitched assessment or is in gross violation of principles of natural justice, or is perverse in the sense that the plea of the assessee has not been properly dealt with. Now, if the 20% payment is not done and the assessing officer denies stay, assessee can also move to the commissioner appeals or the jurisdictional commissioner as well. If they do not also grant any concession to the assessee, then the only remedy left for the assessee is to move the writ jurisdiction of Honorable High Court. In the facts of this particular case of Dilip Kumar Chheda, the addition was made in the hands of the assessee on the basis of statement given by one person, Nilesh Bharani, who was running a concern Evergreen Enterprises, that the assessee has given some cash loans. However, in the course of assessment, that person did not appear for cross-examination. And in previous assessment year, when similar addition was proposed by the assessing officer, he had also filed his retraction statement. Therefore, assessee made out a case that prima facie he has a very good case. The addition is made only on the basis of a third party statement, which has already been retracted, and there is no other evidence except his statement and certain entries in the telephone diary. Therefore, an unconditional stay should be granted, which was rejected by the assessing officer. And therefore, we moved the Honorable High Court. Honorable High Court observed that reliance placed on an uncorroborated statement of third person was highly questionable. Mere entries in the telephone diaries also do not lead to a good case for addition. And therefore, in such a case, when the person himself had retracted from the statement and an opportunity of cross-examination could not be granted to the assessee, High Court directed that entire tax demand should be kept in abeyance till the disposal of appeal by the commissioner. A very useful decision of Supreme Court in Pepsi Foods, which deals with Article 14 of the Constitution, which provides one of the fundamental rights of equality. Article 14 is worded like, the state shall not deny to any person equality before the law or the equal protection of the laws within the territory of India. A question may arise in the mind of professional that how this right to equality under Article 14 is concerned with the administration of tax laws. However, equality under Article 14 is not to be understood only in a layman's sense that everybody should be given an equal treatment. There are various facets of the right to equality. Discrimination and arbitrariness are two vital attacks on the right to equality. And therefore, whenever any discrimination is there, or whenever there is arbitrariness on the part of the assessing officer or any officer of the department, arbitrary action of authorities infringes upon our right to equality. In the facts of the case, what was the subject matter of challenge before the High Court and then finally before the Supreme Court was the third proviso to Section 254(2)(a), Section 254 deals with appeal to the tribunal. As we just discussed that when our first appeal is pending before the commissioner appeal, we can move the assessing officer for grant of stay of demand under section 220 subsection 6. However, if an assessee loses in the first appeal and in the appeal is pending before the tribunal, then section 220 subsection 6 does not explicitly give any power to the assessing officer to keep the demand in abeyance. Therefore, section 254 subsection 2a provides that in such a situation, assessee can file a stay application before the tribunal, and then tribunal has the power to grant stay. However, under subsection 2a, the tribunal's power to grant stay is subject to a condition that stay will be granted for maximum 180 days only. If the appeal could not be decided within that period of 180 days, and if the delay is not attributable to the assessee, then assessee can apply for an extension of the stay, and in that situation, tribunal may extend the stay. But there is a further cap introduced by Finance Act 2008 that even the extended period, the earlier original period of stay plus the extended period of stay cannot be more than 365 days. On the top of it, the third proviso to section 254 subsection 2a provides that if your appeal is not decided by the tribunal within 365 days, then even if the delay in disposing of appeal is not attributable to assessee, your stay will get vacated automatically. And this was challenged before the High Court. And High Court held that this particular condition, given in the third proviso, that where even the delay is not attributable to any default on the part of the assessee, because in real life, the matter in the tribunal may get delayed for several reasons. Sometimes adjournment might be sought by the departmental representative. Sometimes on a particular date of hearing, which is fixed for hearing, that particular bench might not be functioning. For such various reasons, which are simply beyond the control of the assessee, if the appeal could not be decided within 365 days, the law laid down in the third proviso that stay will get automatically vacated after expiry of 365 days is totally arbitrary and discriminatory, and therefore it was struck down as offending Article 14 of the Constitution of India. This striking down by the High Court was challenged by the department in Supreme Court. Supreme Court upheld the striking down of such proviso, the third proviso, by the High Court. In Supreme Court has held that the third proviso should be read that stay will be vacated only if the delay in disposing of the appeal is attributable to the assessee. Earlier it said that even if delay is not attributable to the assessee, after 365 days, stay will get automatically vacated. That proviso Supreme Court has said that should be read. Stay will get vacated after 365 days only if the delay in disposing of the appeal is attributable to the assessee. Therefore, in all cases where the delay is not attributable to the assessee, tribunal has the power to extend the stay even beyond the period of 365 days mentioned in section 254 2a. Under decision of jurisdictional Bombay High Court, in fact, a very interesting decision in case of Salsette Catholic Cooperative Housing Society. Earlier, section 153, which deals with time limit for completion of assessment, did not provide any statutory time limit for passing orders giving effect to the orders of appellate authority like Commissioner Appeal or Tribunal. However, now Section 153 has been amended and it provides that an order under Section 250, that is Commissioner Appeals order, once that order is passed, then the consequential order giving effect to that Commissioner Appeals order should be passed within 3 months. In exceptional situation where the order giving effect cannot be passed within the period of 3 months, then the assessing officer has to seek approval of the principal commissioner, and then principal commissioner has to record the reasons why it could not be passed within 3 months. And if the principal commissioner gives his approval, then the order giving effect can be passed subsequently, but also in the extended period up to 6 months. In the facts of the case, associate successfully argued his case before the Commissioner Appeal. The orders of Commissioner Appeal were in favor of the assessee. The 20% deposit which assessee has made at the time of filing appeal before the Commissioner Appeal was therefore becoming refundable to the assessee, as Commissioner Appeal's order was in favor of the assessee. This refund was not granted to the assessee in the statutory period of 3 months given under 153(5), nor even in the extended period of 6 months. Section 244A, which deals with refund, which deals with interest on refund, there also one subsection 1A has been inserted, which provides that where a consequential order giving effect to the appellate order is not passed within 3 months, then assessee will be given additional interest of 3% per annum. Normally we get 6% per annum interest on refund. But if appeal effect order is not passed within 3 months, then you get an additional interest of 3 months. In the facts of the case, though Commissioner Appeal orders were in favor of the assessee, the consequential appeal effect orders were not passed by the officer. Refund was not granted in the normal period of 3 months, nor even in the extended period of 6 months. No additional interest was granted under Section 244A(1)(a). On the top of it, after filing of this writ petition before the High Court, where we had challenged the inaction on the part of the assessing officer and requested a mandamus from the High Court to direct the assessing officer to pass the consequential appeal effect orders and grant statutory interest under Section 244A subsection 1A. After filing the writ petition, the department produced in the court appeal effect orders which was manually passed without a din. We also produced before the High Court CBDT circular number 19 of 2019, which said that every notice, order, communication issued by the Income Tax Department is required to be generated electronically, and it should have a particular DIN, that is a document identification number. If DIN is not there, their order will not have any force of law. Considering all these arguments, Honorable High Court directed the Principal Commissioner to look into the issue of passing consequential order without a DIN, to look into the case of whatever pending demands, if any, are due against the assessee, and then issue a refund along with interest under Section 244A within 8 weeks of receipt of the High Court order. Next judgment of Honorable Delhi High Court in case of Pacific project, it deals with the time limit for passing amended order or rectification order by the tribunal. Section 154 deals with rectification of mistake apparent from record in order passed by income tax authority. However, tribunal not being covered by the definition of income tax authority, tribunal's order cannot be rectified under section 154. There is a separate section dealing with amendment of tribunal's order, and that is section 254 subsection 2. Earlier section 254 subsection 2 provided for a time limit of 4 years. However, now the time limit is reduced only to 6 months from the end of the month in which the order was passed. Now, this particular language of subsection 2, that 6 months from the end of the month in which the order was passed, practically is a challenge, because in income tax tribunal, when the hearing takes place, generally the orders are not pronounced and dictated at the conclusion of the hearing. Like if you go to High Court, whenever any matter is heard, the order is passed immediately and dictated in the open court. However, in the income tax appellate tribunal, the matters are only heard in the tribunal, and thereafter, after the hearing, a date is fixed for a pronouncement, which is also notified in the notice board, and thereafter the orders are uploaded on the website as well as posted to the assessor. Now, practically, in many cases, the orders are not uploaded on the income tax appellate tribunal website on time. In many cases, they are not posted and received by the assessee on time. And therefore, the controversy was whether this 6-month time limit should be counted from the date of passing of the order or from the date of receipt of the order by the assessee. The language suggests that 6 months from the end of the month in which the order was passed, which is very harsh, because the order might be passed today, but it's quite possible that that order is received by the assessee after 2 or 3 months, and sometimes even later than that. Therefore, Delhi High Court was dealing with this particular situation. Delhi High Court has held that the principle of natural justice suggests that this limitation would not start from the date on which it is pronounced by the tribunal. Limitation should start from the point when the said order came in the knowledge of the assessor, because only then the assessee can take a professional guidance and do all the procedure for preparation of that miscellaneous application and filing of that miscellaneous application before the tribunal. Therefore, Delhi High Court has held that even though the wording in the section is end of the month in which the order was passed, to give full effect to the intention of the legislature in section 254(2) is to rectify a mistake which is apparent from record. The limitation should run only from the date that order came in the knowledge of the assessee and not from any earlier date. I don't see any further question in the chat box. If anyone wants to orally ask any doubt with respect to the cases discussed till now, you can raise your hand and unmute themselves.
Vijay sir, I have one question.
Yes.
In the case of the Madras High Court decision where the courts have held that it is not an obligation of the assessee to intimate about the death of the person,
Yeah, that is Delhi High Court.
right? Delhi High Court. So there, I am not aware if the department took this argument or to say that how is department otherwise supposed to know about the death of the person?
That
And-
argument was raised by the department. Delhi High Court said that the law should provide for some procedure. If the law is silent,
Can somebody
Mhm.
say that a procedure is implied? For example, see, there are a lot of bank accounts and a lot of other compliances which a person has to take upon death of a person. I am not aware if there are specific guidelines which say a particular person to comply with those regulations. But I think a bank account which is open in the name of a person who is no longer alive is to be shut down immediately upon the fact of the knowledge. and you have to a particular person has to inform the banker that the person is no longer, and hence the account may be terminated or the nominations are to be carried on. So and while I think this is somewhere, and while I was a student of contract law, and there it was more on a law which says that who is the person on whose the onus is casted, and generally it is said the person who is private to the particular information is the person on whom the onus will be casted to inform the other. And a similar typical, so while I understand a skylight hospitality, a spice entertainment decisions which have laid down the ratio to say that once a person is dead, a notice can be issued, but I remember that in those decisions it was said that even after the assessee informing the department that a particular person is deceased, or for example there is amalgamation with whatever is happening, still thereafter the notices were issued in the name of the deceased person. So is that ratio being stretched too far, or do you think it's perfectly fine? And
Have you read Maruti Supreme Court after Skylight?
right, that's another decision.
Anyway, see, I look it from a different perspective. Just for a moment, forget about we are sitting in Mumbai. Let's talk about some assessee sitting in a remote village. The length and breadth of our country, the vast population, and the level of illiteracy. We have a basic exemption limit of only 2,50,000 rupees. I'm just giving a common sense perspective. Basic exemption limit in our country, I personally believe, is too small. And therefore, anybody doing any little economic activity except agriculture, if he's honestly doing any economic activity, almost everybody is a taxpayer. Now, just imagine a situation. You are trying to mix up probably a situation of an amalgamation of a corporate entity with the death of a person. Though in legal parlance, you might be correct that in case of an amalgamation, the old entity is no longer into existence. It is a new entity which is in existence. And same happens in case of an deceased person. Then once he dies, he is no longer into existence. But I look at it from a different perspective. And just imagine a situation, there is a one person who is the bread earner in the family who is working. He has a wife or minor children. The wife is an illiterate, not simply aware of any economic, any understanding. Now, the moment the working person dies, just think from common sense perspective. The wife of the deceased person would have a little common sense. You know, if there is a bank account in my husband's name, I should do some action to take those funds in my name or something like that. I personally don't expect that person in such a situation, even by applying common sense, to think of that. I should also intimate the income tax department that now so and so person has died, and therefore whatever consequential action. I personally feel so, I may not be wrong, but I personally feel so that in our social setup, it's too much to accept that there is a duty cast on the legal representative to inform about the death. Secondly, one more angle to it is that what the law says is, law does not say that the moment a person is died, there cannot be any proceeding against that particular person. If you read section 159 very clearly says that what is required to be done by the assessing officer is that he has to bring the legal representative on record. So whatever action could have been initiated against the dead person, if he would have been alive, can be taken by the assessing officer, but the only requirement is that you bring the legal representative on record. Even if there are proceedings which are already initiated against a person, and during the pendency of that proceeding, that person dies, law provides that you bring the legal representative on record and then you continue that proceeding. So that much It is already there in section 159. Now, if a person has died, court is only saying that when you issued that notice, that person is no longer in existence, that notice is invalid. Now, if that notice is invalid, what is to be done by the department? Department has to issue a fresh notice in the name of the legal representative. Practically, what happens is, when notice is issued to dead person, and I've seen many such cases, even after the issue of that notice in the name of dead person, when it is intimated by some of the family member that the person is no longer into existence, instead of issuing a fresh notice in the name of the deceased person, in the name of legal representative, they still continue the same process on the basis of this argument that you never intimated us before, and therefore we already issued that notice. At that time we were not aware. My argument is that, okay, you were not aware. Now you have become aware. You take whatever proceeding is available to you as on today. It might be a different story that today issuing a fresh notice in the name of legal representative might be time barred. But then law never said that reassessment notice can only be issued in the last week of the 6th year. Law provides for a maximum period of 6 months. No one stopped them from issuing the reassessment notice at an early stage. If they would have started sending reopening notices in say 4th or 5th year, if the legal representative is replying that person is no longer, still time would have been there with the department to issue notice in the name of legal representative. Now, just now, because their action is now be time barred, that cannot be an excuse to revalidate a notice which is invalid. That is my perspective on it.
Sir, is there any time limit that legal representative should inform the income tax or bank or for demat account? Is there any time limit?
I am saying as far as income tax is concerned, I don't see there is any requirement for the legal representative to intimate. Only thing is, practically speaking again, the year in which the death takes place, till the date of death, the income is accrued to the deceased person. And if that income was above the exemption limit, then the return for that particular part of the year has to be filed by the legal representative. And for that, there are certain formalities to be done on the portal. If those formalities are done on the portal, then automatically there is an intimation to the department. So the intimation could be directly or it could be indirectly.
So there is no time limit as such, right?
There is a time limit as such.
For banks also or for demat account holding or anything, there is no time limit for that.
Bank, demat, not to my knowledge, there is time limit. Again, and from common sense perspective, I would say, how could there be a time limit for that? Only thing is,
6 months or 1 year also.
Account, operating that account might be illegal because opening an account is it's a contract. So the privity of contract is between that person and the banker. The moment that person has died, that contract has ended. Now, suppose there are certain checks which are signed by that person before the death and still in the possession of the representative, and he is presenting or using that check to operate that account. I would say personally that is an obviously an illegal action. Once that person is dead, you cannot use those checks. But other than that, there cannot be any time limit. So suppose somebody is not even aware of a particular bank account. The family member is not aware. And after 6 years, 7 years, he comes to know that there was some bank account, some FD in his name. Can the bank refuse that money? I don't think so. That just because you're not informed within 6 months, 10 months, the general law of limitation might apply. But other than that, there cannot be any time limit for intimation.
Right. DJ sir, just to paraphrase what you have said, one thing is you said that there is an indirect intimation in case of persons who are continuously filing returns, because the moment there is a death, the period post death will be the return for a period post death has to be filed by the legal representatives or executors as the case may be. However, in case of persons, for example, who are not at all filing returns and there is a notice which is being issued by AO, you said that maybe if for the first time the AOs are issuing notices in the name of the deceased person, but after getting informed or after being informed, by the legal head that this person is no more, can the subsequent notice be issued by the officer on the legal heirs and that will be valid, or you will say the initial?
If it is in time limit, if it is within the time, it is valid.
Okay, perfect.
There is one query about with respect to rectification pending with jurisdictional officer and appeal is also filed with CIT appeal for the same matter. Once order received favorably, what is legal standing of appeal pending with CIT appeal? Whether CIT can enlarge its jurisdiction for other matters which are not in appeal? I believe yes. Once you filed an appeal, that is an extension of assessment procedure. So CIT appeal can deal with other matters also. But generally, practically, I have seen in 99% of the cases, CIT appeal does not go into other matters. And also there is a jurisprudence on that though this particular phrase that appellate proceeding is an extension of assessment proceeding, in fact, has been generalized and too far, has been stretched too far. There is a settled jurisprudence on that. What CIT appeal can look after is only the issues which were the subject matter of the assessment. It is not such a wide discretion that anything which was not even the subject matter of assessment, something a new source of income, which was never contemplated by the assessment, such areas cannot be touched by CIT appeal. Then another query that is seen that department is issuing notice under 143(2) after assessee has filed return of income under section 148, and in the notice issued under 143(2), department has out an annexure stating the reasons to reopen. Is the department allowed to give reasons as the part of annexure under 143(2)? Aren't they supposed to issue reason and give chance? Of course. See, as per GK and Dryshaft, firstly he has to give us the reasons, then assessee has a right to file the objection, then he has to dispose of those objections. And one step further, our jurisdiction High Court in the case of Asian Paints has laid down that even after disposal of objection by the assessing officer, he has to wait for a period of 4 weeks before commencement of assessment proceeding. And therefore, this particular practice which I've seen in the recent notices, that in the 143(2) there is an annexure in which the reasons are mentioned, is in gross violation of the principle laid down in GK and Dryshaft and Asian Paints. Department has commenced with the assessment proceeding even before furnishing of the reasons to the assessee, and in fact, that directly attacks on the right of the assessee to file objection. There is a serious breach of the principle laid down by Supreme Court in GK and Dryshaft and Asian Paints case. Moving forward, to reduce litigation, Corman introduced.
Sir, Mr. Kunal has one question.
Yes, sir.
Kunal Mansi Reshamwala. You can just unmute yourself. Mr. Kunal?
Yeah. Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Hi, Devendra sir.
sir.
Good evening. Yeah. My queries basically are on the case laws which you have referred on the assessment order passed in the name of a dead person. Okay. And we were discussing that point. I just want to know, in the case of amalgamation, when you have approached the High Court, do you need to separately intimate the jurisdictional AO?
No.
Because the High Court will anyway issue the notice.
Income tax department is a party to it.
Party to it, yeah. So there is no specific requirement to intimate to the A.
Absolutely not.
Okay. And my follow-on question is also regarding section 292 BB, where suppose you have, in the case of a dead person, the legal heir has attended the hearings, and at the very fag end, he's saying that, okay, he has just intimated that this person is no longer alive, but he has cooperated in all the proceedings. So referring to 292 BB, is there any...
I believe 292 BB will only talk about the serving of the notice. Here the question is about the validity of the notice itself. So in this case, even 292 BB, I believe, will not help the department.
Okay, fine. That was... Thank you. Thank you so much.
292 BB only serves about mode of service and time of service of notice. Not served upon him, not served upon him in time, or served upon him in an improper manner. This is all about serving,
Okay.
not about the
So here it
issue.
is invalid notice at all.
It is an invalid notice. So it goes to the root of the issue of the notice itself.
Right. In other words, it cures a procedural defect and not a jurisdictional defect.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Girish Gala has raised his hand.
Yes, sir.
Girish bhai, Mr. Girish Gala. Okay, you can move ahead, no problem.
Excuse me,
Yes, sir. Tell me.
just Mr. Devendra, now you said the objection time for 4 weeks and all this. So where the AO doesn't pass an order for objection, and when we file the rate, then there are recent certain decisions where it has been remanded back. Normally they used to struck down. By intimating the AO about you have to pass the order and then issue 143(2), then in that case, what are the chances it will struck down or it will remand back?
If you challenge this particular action, you see, once you have received the reasons, the first thing is, even if it is received in the part of 143(2), I would say it will not be a good thing to challenge directly before the High Court. You have to raise the objections before the assessing office. And then you have to tell him that you keep this 143(2) in abeyance and firstly you deal with my objections. That will be the right course of action.
Girish bhai, you can unmute yourself.
Yes, I will. Hello.
We will move forward a little bit and then we'll again,
Yes.
after 5-10
Yeah,
minutes, we'll again take questions.
Yes, I'm asking you the question. In the case of legal representative, if he files the return for the first year and the assets are still to be distributed, what happens to the next financial year or next assessment year? What is the responsibility on the legal representative?
Till the time they are not fully distributed, it becomes
Yes.
an estate.
Yeah, but
File the return as in the name of the estate.
so do we have to take a separate PAN number for the
Yeah.
estate?
Yes.
Yeah, but then what happens to the
But
TDS?
for
which has
that,
been
we'll have to obtain the order of the court.
See, there are only movable assets, but then there are some issues because in this COVID period, everything could not be distributed. See, like for example, there are shares, the demat account, the death certificate itself took about 8-9 months to get. And what happens to in the intervening period? The TDS, all the TDS is been accumulated in the deceased person's name. So
See,
how do
that
you
is
take
all
the credit?
These are all administrative hassles. As far as there could be two kinds of possibilities.
Yes.
One, after the death, there is a dispute. If there is a dispute, then till the dispute is resolved and distribution takes place, it is the estate for which a separate return is to be filed. If there is no dispute, then there is no question of any estate coming into existence. On the date of death, whatever is the legal right of various legal heirs as per their respective succession laws, they are entitled to that. Now, practically, they may get it after 3 months, 6 months, that is a different story. But the right is established on the date of death itself.
Yeah, right has been established, but the problem is, filing of the return.
Then that income has to be taken in their respective names. You file the return in their respective names for those respective assets which ultimately come to your share. You ask for the TDS credit, which though it is appearing in the name of death person, and then fight for it. For the credit, you will have to fight.
They will have to fight. But otherwise,
that does not give rise to any estate. You cannot file, in my view, a separate return in such a scenario.
No, but just a small question out of this. Can the legal representative file for the second year also? In the
That's
name
what I'm
of the,
saying. If there is no dispute, I believe no. The estate does not come into picture.
but then the taking of the PAN number is mandatory for the estate.
If there is an estate, if there is a dispute, of course, yes.
But can he not file in the same old PAN number and file the return till the assets
No.
are distributed?
No.
See, finally, the government wants the income tax. So the legal representative is willing to pay the tax.
But
Why-
there's a
why-
procedure for it.
Girish bhai, data different story. We will stick to the topic. We are taking the same lecture afterwards within next month.
Okay,
So
thank
please
you.
don't go into those details. Devendra bhai,
Okay,
yeah.
okay, thank you, thank you.
please.
Okay, okay, no problem.
Screen sharing, I believe, stop. Again,
Yes, yes, the screen sharing has stopped.
is my PPT visible?
Not yet. It has now.
The next topic is Vivad Se Vishwas, scheme which was introduced in the year 2020 to settle all the pending appeals in the income tax matter after the successful introduction of that scheme in indirect tax regime in the name of Sabka Vishwas Legacy Dispute Resolution Scheme. They introduced similar scheme named as Vivad Se Vishwas. Unfortunately, a scheme which has come for eliminating litigation has also been subject matter of so much litigation before various courts. And the problem is that there is no right of appeal if your application under Vivad Se Vishwas is rejected. The only remedy is to move the High Court. So certain interesting proposition out of those litigation, I filed 3-4 decisions. The first one in case of Govindarajulu Naidu. In this case, there was a survey at the SSC wherein the statement was recorded that SSC has received some cash from his customer for sale of certain office units. After the survey, 148 notice was issued. In the written file in response to that notice, also SSC declared such cash receipt as his income. Assessment was completed on the basis of that return. Thereafter, SSC filed a retraction affidavit and explained the circumstances in which the original statement was recorded during the survey. And he said that I have not received any cash, and on that basis an appeal was filed. Later on, when this Vivad Se Vishwas scheme was introduced, he thought of settling that appeal and made an application under Vivad Se Vishwas. That application was rejected by the department on the plea that it says whatever was your returned income, that only has been assessed by us, and so there is no dispute. If there is no dispute, there cannot be any disputed tax, and therefore there is no Vivad. And so the Vivad Se Vishwas application was rejected. We challenged that rejection before the Bombay High Court. Our argument before the Bombay High Court is that the right of first appeal is only with the SSC. When SSC files an appeal, that means there is a dispute. The contention of the SSC may be a valid contention, it may not be a valid contention. That is for the appellate authority to decide. So whether the appeal is maintainable, whether the appeal is not maintainable, whether the appeal is competent, whether it is not competent, it is for the appellate authority to decide. The moment appeal is filed, there is a pending appeal, and the only requirement under the Vivad Se Vishwas Act is that there should be a dispute and there should be a pending appeal. Since there is a pending appeal, SSC had rightly filed an application under Vivad Se Vishwas, and that has to be accepted by the department. This plea was accepted by the Honorable Bombay High Court based on the earlier judgment of Supreme Court in the case of Shatrushalya Digvijay Jadeja, which dealt with a similar scheme for dispute resolution under the earlier scheme, Kar Vivad Samadhan scheme, etc. There also Supreme Court had observed that for the settlement under the scheme, only requirement is the pendency of appeal. Whether the appeal is competent or not, it is for the appellate forum to decide. Before that appeal is decided, if the SSC opts for settlement under Vivad Se Vishwas or any such similar scheme, then that has to be accepted as a valid application under the Vivad Se Vishwas. Another decision of Honorable High Court in case of Macrotech developers. Now, one of the disqualification under Vivad Se Vishwas that if there is a pending prosecution for the same assessment year, then that assessee is not eligible to file a declaration under Vivad se Vishwas. In the facts of the case, assessee's plea was that though for the same assessment year, there is a pending prosecution against me, but that prosecution is not with reference to the tax area which is in dispute in my appeal. The disqualification should be only vis-a-vis those prosecution which relate to the issue which are pending in appeal. If altogether two different propositions are there, say for example, there is some disallowance in computing our income and assessee has filed an appeal for that. Now for the same assessment year, if there is a prosecution pending against the assessee for non-payment of TDS, now this pending prosecution is not with reference to the tax area which is in relation to the appeal which is pending. And therefore such an assessee should not be debarred from applying under Vivad se Vishwas Act. Honorable High Court held that the objective of the scheme is to reduce the litigation, and looking at the objective, when the pending prosecution is only with reference to that particular tax area, then that could be a disqualification. However, if pending prosecution is with reference to a different issue, then with reference to the tax area, in the pending appeal, assessee should not be debarred from making an application under Vivad se Vishwas. In another case before the Delhi High Court, where the appeal was filed belatedly with an application for condonation of delay, when Vivad se Vishwas scheme was launched, assessee made application for settlement. That application was rejected by the department on the proposition that there is no pending appeal because the appeal is filed belatedly. Here also the Delhi High Court held that the moment assessee had filed an appeal with an application for condonation of delay on the date of introduction of VSV Act, that condonation plea was also not decided by the Commissioner Appeal. It was also pending, and therefore there was a valid appeal pending which can be settled under Vivad se Vishwas. Moving forward to the next topic about prosecution. Karnataka High Court dealt with a situation which is nowadays seen very commonly in various prosecution cases. Whenever there is a prosecution against a company, along with the company, it is also the directors who are prosecuted. However, prosecution for an offense is a criminal proceeding, and for a criminal proceeding against the directors of a company, it is only such directors who are in day-to-day in charge of the affairs of the company and who are responsible for the particular act which has led to the offense by the company can only be prosecuted. When a prosecution is launched, the magistrate who takes cognizance and issues summons has to pass a reasoned order as to what was the role of that particular director vis-a-vis that particular offense. Without a speaking order by the magistrate, the issue of process itself is bad in law. Secondly, if a particular director is not residing within the jurisdiction of that particular magistrate, then there is a further procedure under section 202 subsection 2 of CRPC. The magistrate has to conduct an inquiry either himself or through a police officer or through the departmental officer to find out whether or not there is a sufficient ground to proceed against the accused. Why I have selected, in fact, these decisions are that generally I have seen the moment prosecution is launched by the department, it being a criminal proceeding, most of the times people are so afraid that they run for compounding. However, practically, the compounding fees in many cases is such a large amount, it is simply not feasible to go for compounding in all the cases. And also, there are many cases which I have seen, they're not at all a fit case for launching a prosecution. Like, for example, the second proposition, this particular decision, where the directors were not residing here, the directors were not signatories to the balance sheet, to the return of income, then they are charged for offense, for example, under section 276(c), willful default in filing return of income. Of course, based on the facts of each particular case. There are many such cases where unnecessarily all the directors are implicated and a heavy compounding fee is levied. Practically speaking, when the prosecution is launched and the process is issued by the magistrate, there are remedies available against it, either to file a revision petition before the sessions court, or also sometimes a discharge application before the magistrate court. And the third remedy is filing a criminal writ petition under section 482 of CRPC before the High Court for quashing of the complaint. These are the various remedies which also should be explored. At least an opinion should be sought from a person who has knowledge of the CRPC, whether it is a fit case for going for compounding or not. Just because the process is issued, department launch prosecution, the only way out is compounding, should not be the practical way out. In another case, for example, in Madras High Court case, when a female was asked about certain entries in the return of income, she had made that statement that her husband was aware about the contents of the return of income. And on that basis, prosecution was launched against the husband on the charge of abetment in filing false return, which was challenged before the High Court. High Court observed that a mere statement by wife that husband was aware about the content of the return does not necessarily mean that husband has abated in filing a false return. It has to be shown that she called upon her husband to do something specifically, and that is supported in committing an act. Prosecution can be launched. Another important finding in this case was that generally prosecution should be launched only after the completion of the assessment. But sometimes prosecution is launched even before the assessment, and court held that that can be done only when incriminating evidences and statement are in possession of the complainant. Mere denial of prosecution version cannot at any stretch of imagination be construed as incriminating evidence. Another decision dealt with section 276(c)(2), which deals with willful default in payment of tax. In this case, the associate filed the return of income, but due to financial problems, self-assessment tax was not paid. Prosecution was launched for willful evasion of payment of tax under subsection 2. High Court held that This prosecution is not for non-payment of tax or late payment of tax. Prosecution is for willful evasion of payment of tax. The fact that assessee has filed the return of income, that itself shows that he never wanted to evade the tax. He has disclosed voluntarily what is this tax liability. Reliance was also placed by the High Court on Supreme Court decision in Prem Das versus ITO, where Supreme Court held that for an offense under section 276(c)(2), a positive act on the part of the accused is required to be established. If there is no positive involvement of the accused, merely because self-assessment tax is not paid, it's not a good case for prosecution under section 276(c)(2). Lastly, the time limit for launching of prosecution. Many times I received several queries for that. That under CRPC, there is a general time limit of 3 years. However, there is a separate legislation dealing with economic offenses. And under that law, there are certain scheduled offenses which include offenses under the Income Tax Act. This says that there is no time limit for launching prosecution under the Income Tax Act. However, there are so many decisions of various high courts. This particular decision of Patna High Court, but we have even our jurisdictional Bombay High Court several decisions which says that though under law there is no time limit specified for launch of prosecution, however, still department has to launch the prosecution within a reasonable time. If it is not done, then it will amount to an abuse of the process of court and harassment to the taxpayers, and therefore such belated launching of prosecution has been quashed by the High Court. Like in the facts of this case, tax evasion alleged was for assessment year 94-95, but the prosecution was launched in the year 2008. By that time, the assessee has already paid the tax and penalty, and therefore High Court held that if after 14 years a prosecution is launched, it will be an harassment and abuse of the process of the court, and High Court did not allow the case to be continued. Before moving to the next topic of capital gains, if there are any other queries, I'll deal with them. I can't see any new queries in the chat box. If anyone wants to orally discuss something, I'll wait for 10 seconds. I'll still move on. A very common and burning issue of denial of exemption under section 1038, terming particular scripts to be penny stocks. So many judgments keep on coming for this. This particular judgment, I would request everybody to read a very beautiful judgment of Delhi High Court in case of Srimati Krishna Devi. Here the AO has extensively relied upon search, etc. conduct the investigation wing. High Court held that reliance placed on the report without further corroboration on the basis of cogent material does not justify the conclusion that the transaction is bogus. Very important for the High Court to observe that the theory of human behavior and preponderance of probability, which is often used in almost all the orders denying exemption under 1038, High Court held that such theory cannot be cited as a basis to turn a blind eye to the evidence on the record. If the transaction is sufficiently evidenced by various documentary proof by the assessee without pointing out any defect in those evidences, addition merely on the basis of spike in the share price and other factors, it may create suspicion, but that cannot be the sole basis for making an addition. Next decision of Karnataka High Court. dealing with a situation where SSC had entered into an agreement to purchase a particular land. However, that transaction was not concluded. Neither possession was received by that party, nor even a registered agreement was executed in his name. The vendor finally sold the land to a third party, but because the assessee had also entered into some agreement to purchase, assessee was made a third party as a consenting party in that agreement. Now, merely because assessee was a consenting party in that agreement, assessing officer invoked section 50C in the hands of the assessee and taxed him on the capital gain worked out on the basis of the stamp duty value of the property. High Court held that assessee was not the owner of the land, and therefore section 50C does not apply to rights in the land or building. Because assessee had merely entered into an agreement to purchase land. With an agreement to purchase land, assessee only had acquired certain right to claim specific performance of that agreement. Unless and until a registered agreement was executed, possession was handed over to the assessee, he does not become the owner of the land. Section 50C is a deeming fiction which applies only in case of transfer of land or building. Rights in land or building is different from the land or building itself, and therefore on transfer of right in land or building, section 50C cannot apply. We also have a similar judgment of our jurisdictional high court in case of Atul Puranik and Greenfield Estate, which says that in transaction like tenancy right or leasehold right, section 50C cannot apply. Another very
Can I just interrupt?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Tell me.
Sir, here, what was the intention of the revenue? Did they wanted to just substitute a 50C value? They could have invoked 50C in the hands of the original seller and not in the hands of the confirming party.
In the hands of original seller also it was invoked. In the hands of the original seller, the amount was matching. Now, the problem was because this party only had some rights in that land, being a consenting party, some amount might be paid to him, which obviously will be much lower than the Reckner value or the circle value of that. So that differential amount was added in his end, invoking 50C. Obviously, case of a double addition.
So maybe the confirming party also received some consideration.
Of course. But that amount would be much lower than the circle value of the entire property. Na? So that difference was thought to be taxed in his hands.
Get it. And DJ sir, any thoughts if 247(6) could have been invoked in the hands of the confirming party to say that any transaction which has the effect of transferring or enabling the enjoyment of any immovable property?
The dispute was not whether there is a transfer by that consenting party or not. For example, if you enter into similar agreement for purchase and for example, you pay a token amount of 5 lakhs, then the deal gets cancelled and third party purchases it, and then you are a consenting party and suppose you are paid totally 8 lakhs rupees. So you get a surplus of 3 lakhs rupees. So the question is not whether this 3 lakh is chargeable to tax or not. Certainly it is a transfer. Question is, what are you transferring? Are you transferring land, building, or you are transferring right in land or building? If you are transferring land or building, they will invoke 50C. If you are transferring only right in land or building, 50C cannot be invoked.
No, DJ sir, I was more on to say when the agreement for purchase was entered, can it be said at that point in time a 247(6) occurred, and therefore the basically whatever the 247(6) got triggered, and therefore the confirming party is the owner.
Okay, you mean to say the moment I pay say 5 lakhs rupees and enter an agreement for purchase of a property say worth 1 crore rupees and I pay 5 lakhs rupees and an agreement or an MOU is entered. So you mean at that particular stage 247(6) is triggered and I become the owner?
And then I'm saying, what will that have any impact?
I don't see that. 247(6) is only giving one of the facet of the transfer, that if such and such transaction which enables the enjoyment of a property, does this paying of 5 lakhs has an effect of enabling me of the enjoyment of that property?
And here the important point will be that possession was not given.
Exactly. I don't see a case in that.
Okay.
Okay. Very interesting decision of Mumbai Tribunal. This tolerable difference which was introduced in section 50C. Whenever there is a agreement, and we are aware that sometimes there might be some difference between the agreement value and the stamp duty value or the reckoner value. For the first time in the year 2018, government introduced a third provision in section 50C that if there is a difference up to 5%, then that will be acceptable. Subsequently, in 2020, this limit of 5% was increased to 10%. Now, in the facts of the case, the transaction was much prior to even 2018. Before 2018, there was no tolerable difference. 2018, 5% introduced. 2020, it was made to 10%. Mumbai Tribunal in this particular very beautiful and nice judgment, it was held that there was a defect in section 50C to benchmark it with reference to the circle rate, and it was causing hardship to the assessee that even if there is a minor difference of say 2%, 3%, I was sought to be taxed on that differential value. To remove this hardship, legislature stepped in and introduced a tolerable difference, firstly of 5% and then later of 10%. Therefore, because it's a provision to remove an hardship to the assessee, therefore, this particular amendment should be considered as the retrospective effect from 2003, the moment from the date when section 50C was first introduced, and therefore for all the previous transaction also, tolerable difference of 10% should be read in section 50. This is a very recent decision of our Mumbai Tribunal. Next decision of Karnataka High Court. So very, very interesting decision. Overruling, I think more than 15 years or 20 years old, probably 15 years old decision of special bench in case of Nandishri, which has been overruled. In the facts of the case, assessee had brought forward business loss. In the current assessment year, the factory building of the assessee was sold, land as well as building, and there was a capital gain. When this brought forward business loss was sought to be adjusted against capital gain, that set-off of loss was denied, and as per the provisions of section 72, business loss could be adjusted only against business income. Assessee's plea was that even though the profit on sale of that land or building is accessible under the capital gain, but still because that land or building was my business asset, it is profit of my business, and therefore brought forward business loss should be adjusted against this capital gain. Assessing officer did not accept. Unfortunately, commissioner appeal as well as tribunal ruled against the assessee. Assessee fought further before the Karnataka High Court. Karnataka High Court analyzed the provisions of section 72 and in section 72, the wording used are loss under the head profits and gains of business or profession. So the loss which you are claiming to set off has to be under the head profits and gains of business or profession, which was the facts in assessee's case. In the later part, section says that this can be set off against profits and gains, if any, of any business or profession. So if you see in this particular slide, the second last paragraph, last sentence, it shall be set off against the profits and gains, if any, of any business or profession. So Karnataka High Court said that in the first part, where they are qualifying the word loss, they are specifically saying loss should be under the head profit and gain of business or profession. However, when it comes to set off against which income, it only says profits and gains of any business or profession. Therefore, legislature intentionally has not used the word under the head profit in the later part. So loss under the head business can be adjusted against profits and gains of any business. That profit or gain of a business might be accessible under the head business income, might be accessible under the head capital gain, might be accessible under the head income from house property. However, if it is profit and gain of a business, brought forward business loss can be adjusted. So in the facts of assessee's case, there was a brought forward business loss, there was a capital gain which arose on sale of business assets, and therefore, even though chargeable under the head capital gain, it was profits and gains of business or profession, and therefore that set off should be allowed. This was a special bench ruling against the SSC, which has been reversed by the Karnataka High Court. Mumbai Tribunal, Pune Tribunal has been consistently already holding it in favor of the SSC. In fact, that has been accepted by our jurisdictional High Court even before the decision of Nandi Steel. In the case named as Hickson and Dadaji, Bombay High Court has also held a similar ruling that brought forward business loss can be adjusted against any profit of a business, whether it is assessable under the head business or is assessable under any particular head. Do we have any question or it's already 6:56?
No questions.
DJ sir, just one point. By this logic, it would mean that all the assets which are held for business purposes are all arising out of profit and gains always.
Correct.
So, assuming when there is no block of asset scenario, can an argument be taken that the gain arising from sale of such assets is also a business profit and gain? As in, it should not be falling under capital gains head. For example, the Colgate Palmolive decision in case of sale of shares of subsidiary company, wherein it is said that the investment which is being held is out of commercial expediency, and therefore it is any gain arising or a loss arising from sale thereof is more of a business profit. So basically, not go up to the level of set off, but at the level of offering it to tax itself, we say it is a business income.
You mean to say that that is chargeable under 28?
Yes.
No, that is a different proposition.
Yeah, I was trying to say two scenarios. First is this decision implies that all the assets which are sold by default would be from the business of profession and therefore will always be eligible.
Yes.
For set off. And second, I'm saying that a stage prior, can an assessee take an argument that, and of course, this will be applicable only in cases where there are no block of assets, because once there's a block of asset, it would be a 50-50 and by default, the computation will fall under capital gains. So, say in cases of shares of subsidiaries, and in that context, the Colgate Palmolive decision of Bombay High Court has on a different footing interpreted and said that the shares have a commercial expediency and have a nexus with the business. And therefore, you take it, offer it to tax, or you basically compute the entire gain will be offered and considered under business income and no need to go under capital gains.
Colgate Palmolive was in that particular factual background when there was a nexus was established, but you cannot generalize that all your business assets which are used for the purpose of business, you can classify under section 28. That will be too far-fetched and interpretation. Here, specifically it was on the wording of section 72 that loss under the profits and gains of business or profession can be set off against the profits and gains if any of any business or profession. So they said because in the same sentence, in the first portion they use the word under the head, and in the second portion they just say profits of business. Therefore, there has to be some difference between the first portion and the later portion. And that's why they have interpreted then. Therefore, the later portion means it is the profit of business. It might be classifiable under any particular head of income, still it is eligible for business. You cannot apply it in a reverse way to say that the moment I using any asset for the purpose of business, the profit itself would be chargeable under section 28. That, in my opinion, is not a correct interpretation.
Get it.
So, with this, I end up my presentation. Thank you very much for the patient hearing. And I thank the organizers once again for giving me this opportunity. If still there are some questions, I am available. Otherwise, over to the conveners.
I'm just scrolling through the chat box and there is some question by Rajesh Ji that a company has earned a long-term capital gain from sale of land and building for FY 2021. Can it be adjusted against business loss for the year FY 2021?
Why is it not visible to me?
I
Can you read
think
it again?
it is,
Can you read it again?
the question is, if the company has earned long-term capital gains on sale of land and building for FY 2021, can it be adjusted against business loss for the same year?
The same year, why is there a difficulty? I don't say there is any bar. Adjusting loss against capital gain. Reverse scenario is difficult. Capital loss cannot be adjusted against business income. Business loss in the same year can be adjusted against capital gain.
Right. I think that's all. We have by and large catered to all the questions. There is one more question from Nilesh Mehta, that can we argue that the tolerance limit of 10% also applies to section 50 CA if shares of private limited companies transferred having only asset as land?
That would be difficult to apply, far-fetched.
I think we have answered, we have considered all the questions raised by the members in chat box. If members have any questions, they may raise their hand and we may unmute you to ask your questions directly to the speaker. We'll just wait for another 30 seconds or so if any members are raising hand. Thank you, sir. I think personally I felt the questions and the case laws basically were from wide array of income tax law covering all the charging provisions, assessments to offenses and prosecution. So thank you, sir, for considering a right choice of decision and discussing it with us.
It was my pleasure.
Anuj, you can conclude.
Yes, yes.
You can vote of thanks.
Now I will request Arif to present vote of thanks for DJ sir.
Thank you, Anuj. Good evening, all the members of Matunga Study Circle. I take this opportunity to thank today's speaker. So we are deeply thankful to you, sir, for accepting our invitation from your busy schedule. It was more interactive lectures, and sir, your in-depth discussion and practical approach, member has benefited out of it. Sir, once again, thank you for accepting our invitation and making this BCM success. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
And just a small announcement for the members that we will be having a session on 28th of August, the details of which will be circulated on the WhatsApp and the email. So please stay attuned to the updates. And thank you, DJ sir, for accepting our invitation and for willingly taking this session for us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, everybody.